The morning was busy inside the hospital lobby. People moved in and out, some carrying papers, some waiting anxiously for their names to be called. The sound of footsteps, ringing phones, and the faint smell of disinfectant filled the air. A woman in a neatly pressed suit walked in through the main entrance. She looked calm and confident, carrying a small folder tucked under her arm. She had the kind of presence that naturally drew attention, but she didn't make an effort to stand out. Instead, she quietly stepped to the side, scanning the room with thoughtful eyes. She wasn't here as a visitor or a patient. She had been given one of the highest responsibilities in this very building, but at that moment no one knew who she was. She preferred it that way. She believed people showed their true selves when they thought no one important was watching. Behind the front desk sat a nurse, clearly overwhelmed with the morning rush. Papers were stacked high, phones kept ringing, and her tone was sharp as she directed people around. She noticed the woman standing there and immediately assumed she was out of place. Without even asking what she needed, the nurse frowned and gestured for her to move away from the desk. "Excuse me, you can't just stand here," the nurse said quickly, not even looking up from her screen. "This area is for staff and patients only. If you're lost, you need to go wait outside or at least stay away from the desk." The woman raised her eyebrows slightly, but her calm demeanor never changed. She stepped closer, lowering her voice so as not to disturb the people around. "I actually have a meeting here this morning. I just need to check in," she said politely. The nurse sighed, rolling her eyes. She didn't bother to ask the woman's name or check any schedule. Instead, she spoke louder this time, as if volume would solve the problem. "Ma'am, I said you can't be here. We're busy enough without people wandering around. Please step outside." A few people in the waiting area turned their heads, curious about the scene. Some looked uncomfortable, while others shook their heads. The woman with the folder didn't react defensively. She stood tall, her expression steady, but her voice remained calm. "I understand you're busy, but if you could just check the schedule, you'll see my name there. I promise I'm not here by accident." The nurse, growing impatient, tapped her pen against the desk. "Look, I don't have time for this. I don't know who you think you are, but rules are rules. You can't stand around here looking like you're waiting for someone important. Please leave." The woman's eyes softened, though her voice carried quiet strength. She didn't argue. She simply waited, letting the silence hang in the air for a moment. Something about her patience made the nurse slightly uneasy, but she brushed it off, convinced she was right. Around them, the lobby carried on. A young mother rocked her baby, an older man coughed into a tissue, and a receptionist across the room tried to calm an anxious visitor. Life inside the hospital didn't stop, but the moment between the nurse and the woman seemed to linger, as though time slowed down. The woman finally spoke again, softly. "Sometimes it helps to ask before making decisions about people. All I'm asking is that you look once," but the nurse didn't move. Instead, she shook her head firmly and pointed toward the door. "Outside, please. We can't have people hanging around who don't belong here." The woman gave a small nod, not in agreement but in understanding. She didn't raise her voice or push back. Instead, she turned slightly and glanced around the lobby, noticing how a few pairs of eyes followed her. Some people looked sympathetic, others curious, but no one spoke up. It was clear the nurse had judged her without a second thought. The woman could have revealed who she really was right then and there, but she chose not to. She wanted to see how far the nurse would go with her assumptions, and so she stood quietly, holding her folder close, letting the nurse's words echo in the busy air of the hospital. The woman stayed where she was, her folder still tucked under her arm, her face calm, though the nurse's voice had grown sharper. Around them, the lobby kept moving, but the quiet tension between the two stood out. The nurse tapped impatiently at her desk, sighing as though she had no time for what she assumed was another person causing trouble. "I already told you," the nurse said, her tone louder now. "This area is for patients and authorized staff. You cannot stay here. If you don't have an appointment, you need to leave. There are rules." The woman's voice remained steady. "I do have an appointment. I'm not lost. I know exactly where I'm supposed to be. All I ask is that you check your schedule." The nurse didn't even glance at the screen in front of her. Instead, she leaned back in her chair, folding her arms tightly. "Ma'am, I've been working here for years. I know when someone belongs here and when they don't. Trust me, I know. And right now, I'm telling you, you need to step outside." The woman could feel the stares of people sitting nearby. A young man waiting with his crutches looked uneasy, as though he wanted to say something but didn't. A mother whispered quietly to her daughter, trying to distract her from the scene. The air seemed heavier with every passing second. The woman didn't snap back. She only looked at the nurse, her expression soft but firm. It takes just a few seconds to check the computer. That's all I'm asking. A few seconds, but the nurse shook her head again. Her impatience grew with every word she spoke. Do you know how many people come through here every day trying to make excuses? If I stopped to check every story, I'd never get anything done. Please stop wasting my time. Her words carried not just impatience but a kind of certainty, a belief that her assumption was enough. She didn't bother to ask for the woman's name, didn't check her list, didn't think for a moment she might be wrong. And in her certainty, she spoke louder, her tone edged with frustration. The woman glanced around the room again, seeing the way others avoided eye contact. She could sense their discomfort, their silent judgment, their unwillingness to step into the moment. Still, she stayed calm. She knew what was happening, but she also knew that her response mattered more than the nurse's outburst. People were watching, and she wanted them to see something different from what they expected. I'll wait right here, the woman said softly, almost kindly, but I'm not leaving. I was invited, and I know my place here. The nurse narrowed her eyes, her lips pressing into a thin line. If you refuse to leave, I'll have to call security. Don't think I won't. I can't let just anyone wander into this hospital. You need to respect the rules even if you don't like them. The woman's patience was striking. She didn't flinch. She didn't argue. She simply nodded once, as though giving the nurse space to choose her next move carefully. If that's what you think is best, do what you feel you must. I'll still be here. A ripple of whispers moved through the waiting area. Some people whispered about the woman's calmness, others about the nurse's tone. But no one spoke up in her defense. It was easier to watch than to intervene, and so the tension grew thicker. The nurse picked up the phone, her hand shaking slightly even as she tried to keep her expression stern. She dialed quickly, asking for a guard to come to the lobby. Her words were clipped and cold. We have someone refusing to leave the desk area. Please come quickly. The woman simply stood still, her folder still in her arm, her eyes watching with quiet strength. She didn't raise her voice, didn't plead her case, didn't reveal who she was. She let the nurse's actions carry on, knowing full well how this would unfold. Moments later, a guard stepped into the lobby. He was tall, wearing the hospital uniform, his expression serious but professional. He walked over, scanning the situation carefully. The nurse pointed quickly at the woman, her voice loud enough for the lobby to hear. That's her. She won't leave. Please escort her out. The guard turned to the woman. Something about her presence made him pause. She didn't look panicked or defensive. She didn't look like someone who had barged in where she didn't belong. Instead, she stood quietly, her gaze steady, her posture strong. He hesitated before speaking. Ma'am, can I ask why you're here? Finally, someone had asked. The woman gave the smallest of smiles. I have a meeting here this morning. My name is on the schedule. If you check, you'll see it. The nurse huffed, waving her hands as though the explanation meant nothing. Don't listen to her. People say anything to get out of trouble. Just take her outside, please. But the guard didn't move right away. Something told him there was more to this story. He pulled out his small tablet, quickly checking the day's appointments. His eyes scanned the screen and suddenly his brows lifted. He looked from the screen back to the woman, then back at the screen again. The nurse leaned over, confused. What are you doing? She's wasting everyone's time. The guard didn't respond immediately. Instead, he read the name out loud, his voice carrying across the lobby. You're here for the director's meeting? The woman gave a simple nod. Yes, a hush fell over the room. The nurse froze, her face draining of color. She opened her mouth, but no words came out. The people sitting nearby leaned forward, realizing what had just happened. The woman who had been dismissed so quickly, told to leave, even threatened with security. She wasn't just a visitor. She was someone important. Very important. The guard straightened, his voice more respectful now. My apologies, ma'am. I see your name right here. You are scheduled for the director's meeting. Please allow me to escort you. The woman nodded politely, her expression unchanged. She didn't gloat. She didn't scold. She simply followed the guard, her steps quiet but sure. The nurse, still frozen in place, stared after her, her chest tightening with the weight of what had just happened. The lobby buzzed with whispers once again, but this time the tone was different. People looked at each other, some shaking their heads, some murmuring about what they had just witnessed. The woman's calmness left an impression that words couldn't erase. The nurse sank slowly into her chair, her hands trembling as she realized the truth. She had spoken harshly, dismissed without thought, and in her certainty she had nearly humiliated not just any visitor, but the very person who had come to lead the hospital. The weight of her mistake pressed down heavy, and she knew there would be consequences for the judgment she had made so quickly. The woman followed the guard through the long hallway, the sound of their footsteps echoing off the polished floor. Her face remained calm, though she could sense the quiet buzz left behind in the lobby. The folder under her arm felt heavier than before, not because of its papers, but because of the way she had been treated moments earlier. She had expected challenges in her new role, but she had not expected her first test to begin at the front desk. As she walked, she thought about the nurse's tone, the certainty in her voice, and the refusal to even check a simple schedule. It wasn't anger that filled her, but a mix of sadness and determination. She knew this moment meant more than just one unpleasant encounter. It was a sign of something deeper, something she would have to face as the leader of this hospital. The guard, who had remained quiet since checking the tablet, finally spoke in a respectful tone. "I apologize again, ma'am. If I had been called sooner, I would have checked first before making any assumptions." She gave him a small nod, her voice gentle. "You asked me the one question no one else thought to ask. That made all the difference." The guard lowered his eyes, humbled. They reached the elevator and he pressed the button for her. "The meeting room is on the top floor. Would you like me to wait and escort you back later?" "That won't be necessary," she replied with a kind smile. "You've done more than enough already." When the doors closed and she was alone in the elevator, she allowed herself a deep breath. She looked at her reflection in the metal panel. Her eyes were steady, her posture upright. She reminded herself that leadership wasn't about demanding respect, but about showing it, even when it wasn't given in return. When the elevator opened, a group of senior doctors and administrators were already waiting. Their conversation paused as soon as they saw her. One of them quickly stepped forward with a warm smile. "Director, welcome. We've been expecting you." The staff greeted her with handshakes and nods of respect. They had read her background, knew of her experience, and were eager to hear her vision for the hospital. None of them could imagine that just moments earlier, in the same building, she had been spoken to as though she didn't belong. She joined them in the meeting room, a large space with tall windows letting in the morning light. They spoke of budgets, patient care, staffing, and the future of the hospital. She listened carefully, asked thoughtful questions, and shared her ideas in a clear but approachable way. Her presence commanded quiet attention, but it wasn't forceful. It was steady, like someone who had earned her place not through title but through character. Yet, as the meeting carried on, her thoughts occasionally drifted back to the nurse downstairs. The look on her face when the truth was revealed was something the woman would not forget. It wasn't just surprise, it was shock, guilt, and fear all wrapped together. She wondered if the nurse would think about her actions later, or if she would brush it aside as just another busy morning. When the meeting ended, several staff members stayed behind to speak with her privately. They wanted to welcome her more personally, to share their hopes and concerns. She listened, offering words of reassurance and plans for improvement. By the time she left the room, the mood among the staff was hopeful. They believed she could bring change, and she carried that trust with her. As she stepped back into the elevator, she made a decision. She would not ignore what had happened downstairs, not because of pride or ego, but because the culture of the hospital mattered. How staff treated people, anyone who walked through those doors, was just as important as the medical care provided inside the wards. Respect and dignity could never be optional. When the elevator reached the lobby again, she saw the nurse still behind the desk. The rush of the morning had slowed, but the tension in the nurse's posture was clear. Her shoulders were stiff, her eyes darting nervously whenever someone walked by. She had not forgotten what had happened. The woman walked over slowly. The nurse noticed her and immediately stood up, her lips parting as though she wanted to speak, but no words came out. The air between them was thick with silence. The woman didn't raise her voice. She didn't display anger. She simply placed her folder gently on the desk and looked at the nurse directly. Her eyes held no cruelty, only truth. "Earlier this morning you asked me to leave," she said quietly. "You didn't ask who I was. You didn't check your screen. You decided what kind of person I must be without knowing anything about me." The nurse swallowed hard, her face flushed. I didn't realize. I thought, that's exactly the point, the woman interrupted gently. You thought, but you didn't know. And in this building, assumptions can do real harm. Not just to me, but to anyone who walks in needing care, needing compassion, needing patience. The nurse's eyes filled with tears. She lowered her head, unable to meet the woman's gaze. I'm so sorry, she whispered. I should have checked. I should have listened. The woman let a pause stretch between them before speaking again. I'm not here to humiliate you. I'm here to lead this hospital. But leadership doesn't mean ignoring moments like this. It means learning from them. For you, for me, for everyone. The nurse nodded quickly, her tears spilling over now. I'll do better. I promise. I'll never make that mistake again. The woman gave her a small nod, then picked up her folder once more. I believe you can, but believing isn't enough. You'll need to show it. She turned and walked away, her footsteps calm, leaving the nurse to sit back down with her thoughts heavy on her shoulders. The lobby once again buzzed quietly with activity. But for the nurse, the world had changed. She realized she had not just spoken harshly to a stranger. She had judged without care, without fairness, and it had nearly cost her much more than embarrassment. And for the woman, as she walked through the hospital halls, she knew this was only the beginning. Her leadership would not just be about policies and budgets. It would be about reshaping the way people treated each other, starting from the very front desk where every visitor's journey began. The next morning, the hospital was quieter than usual. The busy sounds of the lobby carried on, phones ringing, people speaking in hushed voices, the steady shuffle of feet. But there was a noticeable tension in the air. Word had already begun to spread among the staff about what had happened the day before. The new director had been mistaken for someone who didn't belong, and the nurse at the front desk had been at the center of it. The nurse sat at her station, her hands moving quickly over the keyboard, though her thoughts were far away from her work. Every time the doors opened and someone walked in, she felt her stomach tighten. The embarrassment of the day before clung to her, and she replayed the moment over and over again in her mind. The look on the woman's face, calm yet unshaken, was something she couldn't forget. She had been rude, impatient, and careless. She knew it, and everyone else probably did too. When the clock struck 10, a message appeared on the nurse's computer screen. It was short and to the point. Please come to the director's office at 10:30. Her hands froze above the keyboard. Her heart began to race. She knew this was coming. The director hadn't forgotten. The quiet conversation they had yesterday had been only the beginning. Now it was time for the real discussion. At 10:25, the nurse stood outside the director's office, smoothing her uniform nervously, her palms damp. She knocked lightly, and a calm voice invited her inside. The office was bright, with large windows letting in natural light. The director sat at her desk, the same folder from yesterday resting neatly beside her. She looked up, her expression neutral, not unkind but serious. Please have a seat, the director said. The nurse sat down slowly, her heart pounding in her chest. She wanted to speak, to apologize again, but the words caught in her throat. Instead, she waited, her eyes fixed on her hands folded tightly in her lap. The director leaned forward slightly. Do you know why I asked you here today? The nurse swallowed hard and nodded. Yes, ma'am. Because of how I treated you yesterday. The director gave a small nod. That's right. But this conversation is not just about me. It's about the way we treat people who walk into this hospital. Every person who comes through those doors deserves dignity, whether they are a patient, a visitor, or a staff member. Yesterday, you made a decision about me without knowing anything about me. That decision came from assumption, not fact, and assumptions can cause harm. Tears welled in the nurse's eyes as she nodded quickly. I know, I was wrong. I was rushed, and I didn't even think to check. I just reacted. I feel terrible about it. I didn't mean. The director raised her hand gently, not to silence her, but to guide the conversation. I understand that mornings can be stressful. I understand the pressure of the front desk. But stress does not excuse disrespect. Do you agree? The nurse wiped her eyes with a tissue she had quickly pulled from her pocket. Yes, I agree. I was disrespectful. I should have listened. I should have checked the schedule. I should have treated you the way I would want someone to treat me. The director studied her for a moment, then leaned back in her chair. Her voice softened slightly. I believe you when you say you're sorry, but being sorry is only the first step. Change is what matters next. What do you think you can do differently moving forward? The nurse thought carefully. She didn't want to give a shallow answer. She wanted her words to mean something. Finally, she said, I need to slow down even when it's busy. I need to remember that the people standing in front of me are human beings, not problems to move out of the way. I need to listen, to ask questions, to treat them with respect before making judgments. The director gave a small, approving nod. That's a good place to start. Respect is not optional in this hospital. Patients and visitors come here at some of the hardest moments of their lives. They might be frightened, confused, or in pain. The way we speak to them can either bring comfort or add to their suffering. And it begins at the front desk where you sit every day. The nurse listened intently, her tears slowing but her heart still heavy. I want to do better. I don't want to be the reason someone feels unwanted or dismissed. Yesterday opened my eyes. I'll never forget it. The director allowed a pause, then continued. I don't want to punish you for one mistake, but I do want you to grow from it. That's why I'm going to ask something of you. I'm beginning a new training program for all staff, one that focuses on respect, cultural understanding, and empathy. I want you to be part of it, not just as someone attending, but as someone who can share what you've learned from this experience. Do you think you're ready for that responsibility? The nurse blinked, surprised. She had expected anger, maybe even disciplinary action, but instead she was being offered a chance to turn her mistake into something meaningful. She nodded firmly, her voice steady now. Yes, I'm ready. I'll do it. The director gave her a small smile, the first real smile since she had entered the office. Good, I believe you can. Sometimes the best teachers are the ones who've made mistakes and learned from them. If you commit yourself to this, you can help make this hospital a place where everyone feels respected from the moment they walk in. The nurse felt a wave of relief and gratitude wash over her. She stood slowly, clutching her tissue in her hand. Thank you for giving me another chance. I won't let you down. The director rose as well, extending her hand across the desk. The nurse took it, feeling the strength and warmth in the gesture. It wasn't just forgiveness, it was trust. Trust that she could do better, that she could change. As the nurse left the office, she felt different than when she had walked in. The shame was still there, but it was no longer crushing. It had transformed into determination. She wanted to prove that she could grow, that she could be the kind of person the director believed she could be. Later that afternoon, the nurse returned to her desk. The lobby was once again filled with people coming and going. She sat taller, her voice softer when she greeted patients. She made eye contact, asked questions, listened carefully. She noticed how small changes in her tone brought small changes in their faces. Relief, gratitude, even just a little less stress. And though no one else knew what had happened in the director's office that morning, the nurse carried it with her. It became a quiet promise she made to herself. Never again would she let impatience or assumption lead the way. From now on, she would lead with respect no matter who stood in front of her. The director, watching from the balcony above, saw the change begin. She knew it would take time. She knew it wouldn't be perfect, but she also knew that leadership wasn't about perfection. It was about progress. And what she saw in that nurse was progress worth nurturing. Days turned into weeks and the hospital began to feel different. It wasn't a sudden change that happened overnight, but a slow shift that everyone could sense. The director's presence was felt in small ways throughout the building, through new policies, through quiet conversations, and through the way staff started to carry themselves with a little more care. The training program she had promised was put into action. It wasn't just a classroom lecture with slides and notes. It was personal, interactive, and deeply human. The director insisted that every session start with real stories, moments when people had felt ignored, disrespected, or misunderstood. Staff were encouraged to share their own experiences, and for the first time, many of them realized how often small words or actions had left a lasting mark on someone else. The nurse who had once dismissed the director became one of the most active participants. At first, she was nervous to speak, afraid of the judgment that might follow if she admitted her mistake in front of others. But the director encouraged her. When you tell your story, she said softly, you're not just admitting what happened. You're teaching others what not to do. And so the nurse spoke. She told the group about that morning in the lobby, how she had been tired and overwhelmed, how she had seen a woman standing where she didn't expect anyone to be, and how she had chosen to push her away instead of simply asking a question. Her voice shook as she told it, but she didn't stop. When she finished, the room was silent, every eye fixed on her. Then slowly, one by one, heads began to nod. Many of the staff recognized themselves in her story. They too had made assumptions in moments of stress. They too had spoken harshly without realizing the impact it could leave. The director used that moment to remind everyone why they were there. We cannot control every challenge that comes through these doors. But we can control the way we treat people. Dignity, patience, and respect, these are not extras. They are the foundation of care. And it starts with us in every word we speak and every decision we make. The training sessions grew into something more than education. They became a space of reflection and growth. Doctors, nurses, and staff from every department came together, not as ranks or titles, but as people learning side by side. There were difficult conversations, yes, moments when long-held biases were challenged and uncomfortable truths were spoken. But there was also laughter, understanding, and even forgiveness. The nurse found herself changing in ways she hadn't expected. She no longer rushed through her work with a hard edge. She looked people in the eye, asked questions, and listened with patience. And in return, she noticed something remarkable. Visitors and patients responded differently to her. Their shoulders relaxed when she greeted them kindly. Their voices softened when they realized she was truly listening. Even the busiest days felt lighter, not because the work had changed, but because her attitude had. One afternoon, a young boy came in with his grandmother. The grandmother seemed flustered, carrying too many bags while trying to keep up with the boy's quick steps. The nurse, instead of hurrying them along, stood up from her desk and walked over. "Let me help you," she said with a gentle smile, taking some of the bags and guiding them to a seat. The grandmother thanked her quietly, relief washing over her face. It was a small moment, but it left the nurse with a deep sense of peace. These were the kinds of moments she had overlooked before, moments that mattered just as much as the medicine inside the hospital walls. The director noticed these changes too. She watched quietly, never making a show of it, but always observing. She saw how the nurse carried herself differently, how she spoke with more kindness, how she worked with her colleagues more patiently. She knew the transformation wasn't just about one mistake. It was about what the nurse had chosen to do after it. Over time, the culture of the hospital began to shift. Staff reminded each other to slow down, to listen, to ask before assuming. There were fewer harsh exchanges at the front desk, fewer complaints from visitors about being dismissed. The atmosphere, while still busy and stressful, carried a different energy. It felt more human, more compassionate. Months later, at a staff gathering, the director addressed the entire hospital team. She stood at the front of the room, her presence steady as always, and spoke with a quiet strength that commanded attention without force. "When I first walked through these doors, I saw a hospital full of potential," she began. "But potential only matters if we choose to grow. Growth requires honesty, humility, and courage. It requires us to admit when we are wrong and to make it right. I saw that in this hospital. I saw it in the nurse who stood before you and shared her story. I saw it in the way many of you listened, reflected, and decided to change. That is leadership, not just mine, but yours. Leadership happens in every interaction, no matter who you are or what your role is." The nurse sat in the crowd, her eyes welling with tears. She never thought her mistake would lead to this moment, where her story became an example of growth rather than just shame. She realized the director hadn't just forgiven her. She had trusted her to help lead change. When the gathering ended, staff members lingered, talking in small groups about what the director had said. The nurse found herself surrounded by colleagues who spoke to her with newfound respect. Some even admitted they had learned from her story. For the first time in a long time, she felt not just like an employee, but like a part of something larger, a community built on care and respect. That evening, as the sun set behind the hospital, the director walked through the lobby. She paused for a moment, watching the nurse at her desk. A family walked in, tired and worried, and the nurse greeted them with a gentle smile, guiding them with patience. The director felt a quiet sense of pride. This was what leadership meant. Not just changing systems and policies, but changing hearts and habits. As the doors opened and closed, as people moved in and out, the hospital carried on. But something had shifted. Every person who walked through those doors would feel it, even if they couldn't put it into words. Respect, dignity, compassion. These were no longer just ideas written on posters. They were alive, lived out in every interaction. The director picked up her folder and continued her walk, her heart steady with the knowledge that what had started as a painful moment had become the seed of something greater. A mistake had turned into a lesson, and a lesson had turned into change. And in that change, she saw hope for the hospital, for the staff, and for every soul who would walk through those doors in the days to come. Months had passed since the director first arrived at the hospital, and the atmosphere inside the building had changed in ways many hadn't thought possible. It wasn't perfect, hospitals never were, but there was a noticeable difference in how people treated one another. From the front desk to the operating rooms, there was more patience, more kindness, and more listening. The director's vision was slowly becoming reality, not through grand gestures but through everyday actions. The nurse who had once dismissed her was now one of the clearest examples of this change. She had grown into her role in a way that surprised even herself. People who came into the hospital often noticed her warm tone, her willingness to help, her calm presence even on the busiest days. Staff from other departments spoke of her differently now, no longer as someone who snapped under pressure, but as someone dependable, someone who understood the importance of empathy. One late afternoon, as the lobby was beginning to quiet after a long day, a young man rushed in, clearly distressed. He spoke quickly, almost out of breath, about his father who had been admitted earlier. His words tumbled over one another, and his hands shook as he tried to explain. In the past, the nurse might have told him to calm down, might have pointed him toward the waiting area without listening properly. But now she leaned forward, her voice steady and reassuring. She guided him through the process, looked up the information he needed, and even offered him water as he sat down. The young man's shoulders relaxed, and he thanked her with genuine relief in his eyes. Small moments like this showed how far she had come. Upstairs, the director continued her work, though her focus had broadened. She wasn't only thinking about hospital procedures anymore. She was thinking about the people who worked there, the people who came for care, and the community outside the walls. She began visiting departments unannounced, not to inspect but to listen. She asked staff what they needed, what challenges they faced, and what changes might make their work easier. At first, people were hesitant, unsure if they could be honest, but her calm presence, her willingness to sit and listen without judgment, slowly won them over. One day, she stopped by the pediatric ward. The nurses there were overworked, juggling far too many responsibilities. She spent nearly an hour listening to their concerns, about staffing, about equipment, about the emotional toll of caring for sick children every day. She didn't make promises she couldn't keep, but she assured them that their voices mattered. And in time, small but important changes began to appear. New equipment, adjusted schedules, and counseling support for staff who carried heavy emotional burdens. The staff began to feel that this wasn't just a hospital with rules and routines, but a place where leadership truly cared about them as people. It created a ripple effect. Staff who felt supported treated patients with more compassion. Patients who felt respected spoke more kindly to staff. The cycle of stress and frustration began to loosen, replaced by something gentler. The nurse noticed these changes too. She found herself working better with her colleagues, sharing responsibilities without snapping at them when things got busy. When new staff joined, she became the one who showed them the ropes. She taught them not only how to log patients in and handle paperwork, but also how to pause, to listen, and to treat each person with dignity. Her mistake from months earlier had become her greatest lesson, and now she carried it forward as wisdom. One evening, as the day was winding down, the director invited a small group of staff, including the nurse, to her office. She had a new idea she wanted to share. The meeting wasn't formal. She had brought in tea and simple snacks, and they all sat around in chairs, not as leaders and subordinates, but as people talking about something important. "I've been thinking," the director began, her voice steady as always, "about how we can carry this change beyond these walls. We've made progress here, but respect and compassion shouldn't stop at the hospital door. Our community needs it too. What if we began outreach programs, workshops for families, support groups, and community talks about care, dignity, and understanding?" The staff listened carefully. Some exchanged thoughtful glances. The nurse leaned forward, curiosity in her eyes. "Do you mean programs where we go out and meet people where they are?" she asked. "Yes," the director replied with a nod. "Too often hospitals are seen as places of fear or last resort. But if we reach out, if we show people that care begins long before they step into this lobby, we can build trust, and that trust can save lives. The idea sparked energy in the room. Staff began to share suggestions: health education in schools, support groups for families dealing with chronic illness, training for local caregivers. The nurse suggested a workshop for people who often felt overlooked, where hospital staff could listen and learn from the community itself. The director listened to every idea, making notes, asking questions, her face lighting up with the possibility of change. In the weeks that followed, the hospital began to take steps toward these outreach programs. Small at first, but meaningful. A few nurses volunteered their weekends to speak at community centers. Doctors offered free health checkups at local schools. The nurse who had once felt so ashamed of her mistake now found herself standing in front of a small group of parents, sharing her story and explaining the importance of kindness in care. Her voice trembled at first, but soon grew steady, because she believed every word she was saying. The community responded warmly. People began to see the hospital not as a cold institution, but as a partner. Trust began to build, and with it, respect flowed both ways. Patients arrived feeling less fearful, more willing to work with the staff. Families thanked the hospital not just for medical care, but for compassion. The director watched all of this unfold with quiet pride. She knew there would always be challenges: budgets, illnesses, conflicts. But she also knew they had planted something that would grow beyond those challenges. A culture of respect, one that could survive long after her time there. One late night, long after most staff had gone home, the director walked through the empty lobby. The lights were dim, the air quiet. She paused at the front desk, remembering the morning when she had been told she didn't belong. It seemed so long ago now, yet it was the very moment that had started everything. She smiled to herself, not with bitterness, but with gratitude. Even the hardest beginnings could lead to meaningful change. The nurse, leaving her shift late, noticed the director standing there. She walked over, a little hesitant. "You're still here?" she asked softly. The director turned, her smile warm. "Just thinking. This place has come a long way." The nurse nodded, her eyes misty. "It has, and I've come a long way too. I'll never forget how patient you were with me that first day. You could have yelled. You could have ended my job. But instead, you gave me a chance. I don't think I'll ever be able to thank you enough for that." The director placed a hand gently on her shoulder. "You've already thanked me. Every time you greet someone with kindness, every time you show patience, every time you choose respect, you thank me. That's all I could ever ask." The nurse's throat tightened and she nodded. The two women stood there for a moment in the quiet lobby, the hum of the lights above them the only sound. It was a small moment, but one that captured everything they had worked for: growth, respect, and the power of second chances. And so the hospital carried on. Patients came and went. Staff worked long hours, challenges arose and were met. But beneath it all there was something steady, something that could not be shaken. A culture built not on assumptions but on respect. Not on impatience but on listening. Not on judgment but on dignity. It was the legacy of one encounter, one mistake turned into a lesson, and one leader who chose to see people not for their flaws, but for their potential.